Hello everyone, Professor Wolf here. In this video, I want to talk with you a bit about the role of the afterlife in Judaism. This video is actually prompted by a question I got from a student recently. The student writes, Judaism does not seem to have a well-developed concept of life after death or an afterlife, or at least a developed belief in an afterlife. Why does Judaism seem to skip or gloss over the concept of an afterlife, considering how big of a belief it is in other faiths? I think a good sum of people find their belief in an afterlife to be comforting because death can be scary and permanent. Since Judaism does not address an afterlife in a clear and direct way, I'm curious to know why. All right, first of all, let me say I love this question. I love the writing. I love the style. I find the style engaging. I love that this student is connecting religion with the central human concern, our mortality, the fact that we're all going to die, which can be really scary. I love that the student appreciates there may be some belief in Judaism, but it just may not be as developed, might not receive quite the focus that the afterlife often does in other traditions. And by the way, all of that is right, and I think it is very important and very interesting. Judaism, it's a broad term. There have been many forms of Judaism over the centuries. And some, afterlife may have actually been quite central. In some, it really wasn't there at all. In others, I think we could say it's there, and it is in a way central, but in a way maybe not so central. So I'm not Jewish myself, but I have spent a lot of time in synagogues, a lot of time talking with Jews, a lot of time reading books on Judaism by scholars, books on Judaism by rabbis who sometimes are scholars, books written by ordinary everyday Jews, time listening to podcasts by Jews on Judaism, you name it. And I think I can safely report that, while of course there are some individual Jews that think about this a lot, and many Jews do believe in an afterlife, and it's important to many Jews, by and large, it does not have the kind of importance, it doesn't receive the kind of attention, the kind of focus from at least many Jews as it does from many Christians and Muslims. I think we could say this of probably all the major forms of Judaism that are around today and that have been around for many centuries, right? If we look at rabbinic Judaism, we look at the Talmud, there's belief in an afterlife found in the Talmud. We look at some leading figures within rabbinic Judaism, like Maimonides. It's been a while since I've looked at the 13 articles of Judaism as drawn up by Maimonides, but I'm pretty sure belief in an afterlife is one of them. And I've heard rabbis talk about the afterlife. I've heard Jews talk about the afterlife. It's not saying the belief isn't there. And the student isn't saying it's not there. They're saying they have a sense that it just doesn't receive the kind of focus or attention it does often from Christians and Muslims, and then maybe a lot of it isn't defined as much as it is in a lot of other traditions, and students write about that. To understand why, from an historical point of view, so I'm going to take that question in an historical sense and in a scriptural sense. So, given Jewish texts, why this relative lack of, or comparative lack of attention? Given Jewish texts, given Jewish history, how do we get to this point, right? And what is it that Jews are focusing on? Well, actually, we take that. Jews focus a lot on this world, this life, which many Christians and Muslims do too. All right, but I think it is fair to say in Christianity and Islam, we have more of a focus as well on the next world, less so in Judaism, at least the kinds of Judaism we're familiar with. Okay, so again, to try to understand why this came about, we can look at Jewish texts, look at Jewish history. So let's look at Judaism 2,000 years ago, time of Jesus. We got a couple different movements within Judaism. Some of you may be familiar with them, at least some of them. We have, for example, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Sources on these groups are a bit thin, or sometimes, actually, a lot of times there's debates on how exactly the evidence is to be interpreted, assessed, ... But there's pretty wide agreement among scholars. We got good evidence that at least a lot of the Pharisees, they did believe in an afterlife. And it does seem to have been an important belief to them in some sense. When we turn to other groups, we get a different picture, at least some other groups. So, for example, when we look at the Sadducees, a group of Jews from about 2,000 years ago, when we look at the Sadducees, it seems that at least a lot of them did not believe in an afterlife and even rejected it. And we can see this in the New Testament. I believe it's in the Gospel of Mark, and there might be parallels in Matthew and or Luke. I haven't checked on it in a while. But in the Gospels, at least in one of them, we see a group of Sadducees argue with Jesus. Now, look, I don't want to get into debates about whether Jesus was a Jew or born a Jew, started life as a Jew and didn't end as a Jew. I'm just going to talk about Jesus as a Jew, okay? So Jesus is a Jew, and he gets known to other Jews, and he interacts with Pharisees, he interacts with Sadducees, he interacts with others. And at one point, at least according to the Gospels, a group of Sadducees approaches Jesus, and they know that Jesus believes in the afterlife. And actually, they're not very happy about it. And they try to argue with him about it. They try to argue him out of it. They try to give him arguments that you should not believe in an afterlife. They give him kind of philosophical arguments, which also have kind of a root in Jewish law. But they try to expose the afterlife as absurd, impossible, which is kind of extraordinary. And then Jesus offers a rebuttal and makes a case for the afterlife. Not saying it's the only one you find in the Gospels by any stretch, but he makes a scriptural case, a biblical case for it. Right? Okay. So when I talk about this with students in my world religions class or my Old Testament class, sometimes it comes up in other classes, students are often really perplexed by this. They'll say, how could a group of Jews not believe in the afterlife? How could that make any sense? Right? And I think they could be thinking a couple of things at this point. Sometimes I know they're thinking because they tell me, why bother believing in God if you don't get heaven out of it? Like, what would be the point of it? And here I come to the defense of the Sadducees. I got a little bit of a soft spot in my heart for them. And I say, actually, I think there's something very admirable about the fact that the Sadducees believed in God without believing in an afterlife. They would have said, look, I don't need a reward from this being in order to believe. They might have said, look, I don't get a reward from the sun. Actually, we do. So that's a bad example. But there might be all kinds of things you don't get a reward from, but they're true. You believe in them. Okay. Of course, if you're an atheist or agnostic or belongs, different kind of a tradition, you might be saying to yourself right now, well, geez, though, what? Okay, I'm not so sure. I actually think there's a good case for believing in God, right? Okay. I'm just saying, I have some admiration for the Sadducees on this. Maybe I should temper that by saying I don't know a great deal about them. Our knowledge of them is limited. I'm not so sure exactly what, exactly why they believed and believe, and I'm sure there's different reasons for different folks. That's always how it is, right? But anyhow, Sadducees said, look, we're willing to believe without this heavenly reward. We don't believe in it. But then some students will say, but wait a second, though. What about the Bible? Okay, so really quickly, we're not going to get too deep into the Bible, but you look at the Christian Bible, two main parts, Old Testament, New Testament, okay? Really roughly, New Testament is for Christians. Old Testament is for Christians and Jews. And a lot of students, even if they don't have a lot of familiarity with Judaism or Christianity, they have a sense that the Old Testament, the first part of the Christian Bible, or just some part of the Bible, even if they don't know the terms Old Testament, New Testament, they know some part of the Bible is scripture, is sacred, is authoritative, not just for Christians, but also for Jews. And I think they go through this chain of reasoning. It's quite reasonable, actually. It's eminently reasonable. It's quite a sensible argument. If the Sadducees were Jews, wouldn't they have had the Bible as scripture, or at least the Old Testament, or some piece of it? And don't we find the belief in the afterlife in the Bible? So how then could these Sadducees have claimed to be Jews and not believed in an afterlife? Were they like radical reformers? Well, actually, no. The thing is the Sadducees seem to have been conservatives, maybe even arch conservatives. They were traditionalists. Our sense of them is they wanted to stand on Scripture and Scripture alone. They took Scripture so seriously. That's why they didn't believe in the afterlife. And I'm putting this a bit provocatively, but actually it kind of fits our evidence. And then students are even more perplexed. Well, wait a second. Are you telling me the afterlife isn't in that Old Testament? Now, I just want to pause really quickly and say there's a lot of debates about when and where the Old Testament as we know it today, and actually we got a couple different versions of it, when and where it's all put together, when and where it's canonized, could it be put together before there's really this concept of canon? What is the idea of canon? Does that come into great I don't want to get too into the weeds on that. We could say this. 2,000 years ago, time of Jesus, when the Sadducees are around, even if they don't have a full Old Testament in any of the versions we know it today, they've got books from that Old Testament, and they cherish those books, and they regard those books as authoritative. So our question stands, right? How could they not believe in an afterlife? And here's where things might sound really surprising, even shocking, y'all. A lot of scholars of the Old Testament argue there really isn't much of a concept of the afterlife in the Old Testament, that you don't really find the concept at all in the Old Testament, except in very few places, which are, it seems, quite late. For example, in the book of Daniel, which honestly, now you get back to those debates about when the Old Testament's put together, it's kind of hard to figure out what the status of the book of Daniel was at this time. It's a very important book for Jesus, by the way, in the New Testament, in the Gospels. But a lot of scholars would say that there just really isn't an afterlife in the Old Testament until the very last parts of the Old Testament. And the status of those might have been in dispute. It was in dispute. And now someone might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I've read the Old Testament, and I see the afterlife all over it from beginning to end. Well, you got to be careful of a few things, right? The Old Testament is originally written mostly in Hebrew and some Aramaic, and then it gets translated. And even before Jesus, it gets translated into Greek by Jews, for Jews, because a lot of Jews before Jesus are speaking Greek. And in that Greek translation, the translation skews it a bit more towards an afterlife in some ways. And that version, or variants of that version, are used by authors of the New Testament when they're writing the Gospels, when Paul's writing his letters and so forth. The New Testament is written almost entirely in Greek. There's a little bit of Aramaic from the lips of Jesus. There's a couple expressions that could be ambiguous between Arabic and Hebrew. But anyways, the New Testament's pretty much written in Greek. By people who were Jews or, had Jewish backgrounds, right? You had Jewish Christians in the early church. And they're writing the books of the New Testament in Greek. Well, they're citing the Old Testament all the time. Which, again, some scholars would say the whole Old Testament as we know it wasn't even totally put together, all of it as such, until after some of the books of the New Testament are being written. But at any rate, the New Testament authors are citing the Old Testament all the time. They're citing it in Greek. They're often looking at this Greek translation, which is already skewing things a little more towards an afterlife. And then English translations and other modern language translations of the Old Testament often really do skew it more towards an afterlife. So when you start learning Hebrew and Aramaic and reading the Old Testament in the Hebrew and the Aramaic, you often get a bit of a different picture. And also you learn you got to be really careful about the way some language in the Old Testament is taken. Some language that might seem to refer to an afterlife. It's not so clear it really does when you really think about it. And when you start really looking at, some parts of the Bible more carefully, some interesting things emerge, right? So, for example, in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, starting in the book of Exodus, God starts giving these commandments, these mitzvot to Israel through Moses and Mount Sinai. We start with 10 commandments, more or less, in Exodus 20, and then we get more and more and more and more and more commandments. Jewish tradition recognizes 613 commandments in total. And these commandments form the basis of a covenant, an agreement, a pact maybe a bit more loosely a promise, right? But God presents these commandments to the Israelites, to the Hebrews, and says, if you agree to follow these commandments, I will be your God, you will be my people, you'll be my special people. Will you do it? And they say, yeah. And then God's like, well, you should be careful. I need to tell you what the terms are. And they're kind of like, no, we don't even care. We're just going to sign. And God's like, well, wait. And you could see this in a couple of parts of the Torah, but the clearest is Deuteronomy 28. Chapter 28 of the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah, the fifth book of the Old Testament. Moses is reviewing the laws, and he's reviewing the terms of the laws. And in these terms, God tells Israel what God will promise to do for Israel if they agree to follow the commandments and actually do follow them. God tells them how he will bless them. And he also tells them how he will curse them if they agree to follow the commandments and they don't. And God basically says, look, you don't have to agree to follow the commandments. You can walk away if you want. And like, no, sign us on. And God's like, okay, well, now you're signed on. If you're ready to sign on, here's what's going to happen if you sign on and follow the rules. Here's what's going to happen if you sign on and don't follow the rules. So what happens if they agree to sign on and follow the rules? God basically says they will hold on to the land of Israel. They will live to a ripe old age, like maybe 100, 110, 120. They'll have lots of children. Their sheep will have lots of, baby sheep. Their goats will have lots of baby goats. They'll basically live to a ripe old age. They'll have all the food they need. They'll have land. They will be protected from their enemies in war. But God never promises them. God never promises them they will get to go to heaven. He never says that. And when he tells them what will happen to them if they agree to follow the commandments and they don't follow the commandments, if they agree to follow the rules and they don't, he says he'll take their land away and punish them with foreign armies, and they'll die. Not all of them. He'll preserve a remnant and save Israel from that remnant. But he never says he'll cast them in hell. There's no reference to the afterlife at all in any of it, which is really extraordinary, because if there was any kind of robust belief in the afterlife at that point, you'd expect to get it. Now, some people will say, well, but like in the Psalms, sometimes, the psalmist will refer to a place called Sheol and say, don't let me go down to Sheol, like don't let me die, because I go down to Sheol, I can't praise you. And a lot of Christian readers seem to think Sheol is something like hell. But we've got really good arguments from scholars like Tony Long that when it comes to ancient Greek texts, that apparent references to Hades, it's not necessarily that the Greeks who wrote those texts and the Greeks who first read them really thought there was much of an afterlife going on there. In some cases, it might have been they thought maybe your body goes to some place after you die, but you're basically lobotomized or like a zombie. You don't think it's not really much of an afterlife, or it might just be poetic or something of that nature. The bottom line is, and there's disputes about this, of course, right? But a lot of scholars would agree there's not much of an afterlife at all in the Old Testament until you get toward the very end of the Old Testament. And that might bother a lot of Christians, but I'm not necessarily sure it should. By and large, Christians don't believe that every important thing about their religion can be found clearly in the Old Testament. The New Testament actually explicitly tells you that that's not the case, right? But as you can imagine, there's some disputes about that. But now if we return to our question, why isn't the afterlife quite so important in Judaism? I think a lot of it might have to do with the fact that it's just not a major focus of the Old Testament. It's just not a major focus of the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible. It's just, yeah, it is there. I'm not saying you can't find it anywhere. For example, you could look at the book of Daniel. But even in the book of Daniel, it doesn't get a lot of attention. And I just think it's not in many parts of the Old Testament. My sense is it's only in late parts of the Old Testament. And it's not a tremendously big focus even necessarily of those parts. And that book, the Old Testament, Jewish Bible, Hebrew Bible is just so formative for Judaism. I think that's a big part of it. I think there's more that can be said, aspects of Jewish experience, so forth and so on. And maybe we can't come up with a universal historically deterministic interpretation for this, right? Some people might want to say, for example, well, the focus on like law in Judaism, maybe kind of skews it away from an afterlife. But there's a huge focus on law in Islam, yet the afterlife is really important in Islam. Anyhow, it's kind of, for the most part, all I got to say about it, but I'll just add a couple of things. Again, I do want to reiterate, when we look at key texts of rabbinic Judaism like the Talmud, there is a belief in the afterlife. And plenty of Jews do believe in an afterlife. Still, it often does not receive the kind of focus and attention that you see with Christianity and Islam. Actually, something else to add to this, maybe part of the reason here too, is concerns with how to get to heaven were just never quite as big. Or I should actually be careful. I shouldn't say never. I shouldn't make it sound like for nobody. But for huge amounts of Jews, different kinds of movements over at least the last 2,000 years, even if folks believed in the afterlife, often they just weren't so worried about how you would get to heaven. Like Christians and Muslims are often really kind of worried about making sure they get to heaven. They often kind of have an anxiety about that, making sure they got that right. Jews, by and large, just don't worry about it as much. They just kind of have confidence, if you're, excuse my language, if you're not a total schmuck, if you're not a total schlub, you're probably going to get there. One thing I could add is many Jews do not believe in hell. Or they'll say, oh, well, we believe in it. We don't use that English word. We've got our own terms. We believe in it, but not like, a lot of Christians and Muslims do. They'll say, for example, a lot of Jews, even a lot of really conservative traditional Jews will say, God would never torture, and he would never make lakes of fire. He would never make torture devices. There's none of that. There's none of that in hell. And it's a major reason why a lot of Jews like to avoid the term hell. And many would go on to say that if there is any kind of hell at all, many Jews would say, even conservative traditional Jews would say, it's temporary and it's more like a hospital. It's more there to get you on your feet, to heal you so you can be ready to go be with God. I don't know if I've ever met a single Jew in my life who's ever said they believe in a permanent hell. And I've never heard a Jew say with their own mouth that they believe in anything like lakes of fire. And I've heard plenty of even conservative traditional Jews deny it. Okay. So to add a few more things to this, there's a widespread belief in Judaism, I think I might have mentioned a minute ago, that you don't have to be Jewish to get saved. Maybe I didn't mention that, but I should add that. Many, many Jews believe you do not have to be Jewish to get saved. And when we turn over to, actually many Jews would say it's easier to get saved as a non-Jew than as a Jew. I think a lot of times that's kind of meant in a kind of a joking way. Anyhow, I don't want to get too into the details of that. But when we turn to Christianity and Islam, there's often this understanding that all Christians believe in a hell with lakes of fire, and that all Christians believe that if you don't become Christian before you die, you're going to go to hell. There's often this belief that Islam believes in lakes of fire. All Muslims believe in lakes of fire. And if you don't become a Muslim before the time you die, you're going to go to hell. Actually, even a lot of conservative Christians and Muslims both would say, well, we don't really want to pronounce on the final state of anybody's soul. That's really up for God. I've heard plenty of conservative Christians and Muslims both say, only God knows. Many Muslims do believe in lakes of fire because of the Quran and Hadith and other texts. Actually, a lot of Christians do not. Some do, but many do not. And believe it or not, there's actually some Christians that believe that that actually would positively, they would say we can be really confident. Not just we don't, they wouldn't want to say we don't know what's going to happen to people who haven't converted to Christianity before they die. They would say we can be really confident that there will be people in heaven who are not Christian, even people who lived after Jesus, even people who heard about Christianity, that at least some of them will be in heaven. And there's some Christians that go so far as to say everybody will get saved and everybody will be in heaven. So views about the afterlife, they can really vary a bit across different traditions, and within traditions, right? Both. And it's one other thing to follow up, and then I want to end. I think we got really good evidence a lot of ancient Jews did not really believe in much of an afterlife. We have some evidence for that too in ancient Greece, and I think also in ancient India. And there were religions at those times for these people. And I think if we apply some principles of critical thinking, a conclusion we can derive out of this is that even though we are often told that religions are all alike vehicles of salvation, they're meant to get you saved, and specifically saved in some otherworldly kind of way after you die, that's not necessarily true. And to a large extent, that might be a more recent development in the world religions, more recent meaning like last couple thousand years. Then again, we got to be really careful on that as well, and it's really hard to know what a lot of ancient religious people really believed, because they didn't leave writings, and all we have to go on is archaeological evidence, which is highly ambiguous, and a lot of times we don't even have that. All right, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found it useful. I'll see you around in the next video.